The unofficial Jonathan Toews debut is in the books. How did he do, and how did the other veteran Jets that are now joining the team look in preseason action? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are coming back to you a little bit later than expected. Apologies, I did actually want to record yesterday, but unfortunately, in the place I was at, we had noise violations. So we are coming back to you with slightly delayed thoughts on the Toews debut. And I also want to dive into some of the other preseason performers and talk about the potential group that we might see on Friday versus the Oilers. But first, before we dive into all of the fun stuff and talk a little bit about Toews and some of the other veterans that have joined the Jets, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, Johnny Toews, how'd he do? How did Captain Sirius look? Well, I would say he was probably about as expected. I think the first few shifts for the top line with Toews, Nyquist, and Perfetti generally looked pretty solid. Perfetti seems to have added another set of gears to his wheels, and Toews, for his part, could keep up. I think that was the biggest thing, right? I was setting expectations very modestly. It's hard to get up to speed, and I think with Toews, patience is going to be required. The stuff up here is not going to go away, but sometimes getting your body to participate and get up to speed can be a bit of a challenge. And I think, Jonathan has certainly expressed that he's working to do that and that he's really trying to get up to speed. He mentioned earlier a couple weeks ago that the skating legs weren't quite there yet. The feet weren't as quick as he wanted them to be. And after, the preseason game on Tuesday, he said, there was some good, there was some bad. It is what it is. And I think that's probably the game on Wednesday. I think that's probably about as fair of an assessment as you're going to get. I think, with him, it's not so much that it's going to be a smooth process, but I think, from what we saw in preseason, this first game for him was pretty decent. He had some good passes. I thought his vision looked sharp. He had some good net drives and was creating some good opportunities. It didn't really hit pay dirt, but especially the first few shifts, there were definitely some good jumps. And I think, for the most part, we saw kind of what we'd expect from Toews. And I've seen some of you mention that he's not going to play in the bottom six necessarily. And I think that's mostly true for the start of the season. I didn't mean that to disparage him, but more so like if you have him in your bottom six, that's like an elite third or fourth line center. Especially with Lowry coming back at some point, Winnipeg could have some really quality depth additions here. They do still have to figure out the overall 2C situation before the playoffs because, as good as Nemesnikov can be defensively, we know that, in the playoffs, you need a little bit of an extra jump. So if Toews can figure out a way to unlock that, that could be very helpful. I think ideally, given what we're seeing right now, I probably would have gone something like Scheifele, Lowry, Toews, and maybe Nemesnikov or Gustafsson or Barron. At that point, it doesn't really matter to me. The 4C spot is open. It's competitive. But I think if you have that as your four centers, you can sort of figure out the rest. And like Lowry has his own, I guess, gaps, so to speak. And we're not really sure what he's going to be like when he returns. But I think given how we've seen Toews perform in his first game, he looks up to speed. He looks like he can handle middle 6 minutes. He was playing a fair bit in this first game, and the legs didn't really seem to catch up to him, so that's a good sign. We'll see how that handles over the course of the next few weeks and months. As the fatigue and stamina maybe takes a bit of a hit, we'll see if he can keep up. If his lung capacity is still good to go, that, is a tough thing to come back from, especially long COVID. So, I think, again, just be patient, right? He'll have some good games. I think he'll have some bad games. I think it's just going to be par for the course with him. 2 years off the ice is a long time, and it can take a lot to get that game feel back. But I thought he still looked pretty sharp in his preseason debut. Nyquist, I thought was okay. We'll chat a little bit more about some of the other guys, more specifically the veterans that are joining the team, Nyquist, Pearson, etc. But I want to focus a little bit outside of Toews and talk about some of the kids. JT, you kind of knew would be pretty solid, or at least hoped he would be pretty solid. There's been a lot of pressure on guys like Lambert and Chibrikov and some of the others to really step up. And I think Lambert in particular has had a quietly very good preseason. Did notch a point or two for his efforts on some goals. And I thought, the main thing that he's going to do is be, a very creative force who can transition between the neutral zone and the offensive zone and has good offensive zone instincts, right? Because he's such a fast skater, sometimes I think that can be a little hard for him to slow down. That might be the biggest thing that he has to work on, slowing his game to match his line mates, because he's not always going to have guys that are like, full throttle, high octane players. Sometimes he'll get himself isolated and in trouble because, again, he expects his line mates to be at the same level and speed that he is. And that might not always be true. You can imagine trying to match him with Toews could be a very interesting fit. If Lambert can slow his game down, I think he's got a really interesting future with Winnipeg. I think some people are expecting him to be a game-breaking, game-changing presence a la Ehlers. And I think, in some ways he has similarities to Ehlers' game, mostly in the transition. I think the way that he actually approaches the offensive zone, though, is more forechecking oriented. Ehlers was a guy who liked to stretch play by skating around the perimeter and creating offense that way, where you'd get, the defensive shape a little bit askew, and suddenly Ehlers could drive in or make a great feed or something. Lambert is more of a guy who's actually going to do some serious wall work, and I think that was something that showed pretty notably. Salamonson, for his part, had a very solid game. Heinola also had a solid game, more so as the game wore on. You could tell that he's had a lot of time off, and as he started to get into the third period, I thought he had a pretty decent performance. He and Schenn as a third pairing could be very interesting. I think Schenn, obviously the foot speed continues to be a bit of a challenge, but if you give him the right partner and somebody who, can help him with the zone exits and stuff, Schenn knows what he's supposed to do. It's just sometimes when you pair him with a Stanley or a Fleury, those guys have issues to get the puck out of the zone, and it, then falls to Luc. And while he can do that, certainly, I think if you give him a more mobile partner, you can take advantage of that physicality and size that he has in a more efficient way. So we'll have to see if that continues to be a thing over the next few weeks. Heinola will be playing with somebody else come tomorrow evening, so that'll be interesting. But overall, I think the youth have acquitted themselves well. Jokin continues to be, noticeable. I thought Jaeger has been, solid the first game or so. But obviously the big news is Toews is here, and I think it won't be long before he'll record his first official point for the Jets, especially if he plays with Perfetti, who looks like he's got an extra step to his game. So happy to see Cole improving. I think Toews will be a great mentor to both Jaeger and Perfetti. All of the kids can really learn from Jonathan. JT's been around for longer than some of them have probably been alive, and so this is a great opportunity to learn from one of the league's best players, somebody who obviously came through the ranks and, has earned himself a bit of a Hall of Fame ballot one day. So, for the first debut, it might not have been scoreless, but I think you can be pretty happy with what Toews put out there. I want to chat a little bit more about the other veterans because I think there's a little bit more nuance to some of the other arrivals. Some good, some bad. We'll chat about what stood out coming right up in just a brief moment. But before we do, did want to let you know about how you can win big with our partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. If you think you know who's going to win some of this week's matchups, whether it's the Ravens versus the Chiefs or something else, this is your chance to cash in big. maybe you are following along with Seattle versus Arizona, and you're trying to figure out if maybe Kyler Murray can stop throwing picks or if Sam Darnold really is the truth. No matter what, though, the only way that you can cash in on all of your best bets is to go to FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. And remember, that's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to keep the winnings coming. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about some of the other arrivals from free agency. Obviously, Jonathan Toews is the most notable and the one that really stands out for everyone, really across Manitoba, and I think probably in the broader part of the league. The Toews debut and really the comeback to the NHL was a huge story, and a lot of folks were talking about it. Not as many people are talking about the likes of Nyquist, Koepke, and Pearson, though. And these are players that people can easily forget. I don't know that that's really fair, but I get it. The Toews stardom and certainly prestige is going to overwhelm everything. But we had 3 other new players join the team, and one of them's going to have to take on a pretty important role in the Jets' top 6. Gus Nyquist, this is going to be a tough one for him. He's being asked to fill in for Ehlers, right? And we all know that his game is not going to be Ehlers. I've seen some people say it's only been one game, don't read too much into that performance. But it's not like we're talking about a young prospect or a young player who's getting used to a new system. Nyquist has been around for many, many, many years. I remember him from his Detroit Red Wings days back when he was really underrated and quietly one of their best players. These days, Nyquist, I think, is showing that lack of foot speed and age starting to catch up. And the thing with him is that he's going to be a really good poacher. I think if you get him in the net front area or sort of in that goal mouth scramble, that's where he'll make his money. Nyquist still has really good hand-eye coordination, and I think you could see him getting a couple of decent looks. And as a middle six or depth piece, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think if you're asking him to do a lot of the same stuff that Nick did, it's not really going to be the same kind of performance. And I think ideally you'd be looking at him more as a third liner. Right now, the Jets don't have anyone to replace Ehlers, and so Nyquist has kind of become the de facto option. He can still skate decently, but not at the level that you're probably looking for from a guy, again, who was known for flying around the ice and creating tons of opportunities. So I think this year is going to be really telling to see how Perfetti handles it. With Toews, Toews looked like he could keep up. His feet were moving fine enough. The brain is certainly at, a very high level, so you don't worry about that too much. Perfetti, what level is his game going to look like? And I think, if he can find a way to really elevate and sort of carry that trio during, some of the leaner times, that could be really helpful. Toews will be a fantastic complementary piece and probably somebody who is one of the few players with the IQ to match what Perfetti can do. So if they can figure out a way to make the most of Nyquist, I think that's a workable trio. We'll see how the foot speed thing kind of pans out maybe against some of the faster teams, some of the more aggressive forechecking squads. But I think that there's a way to make it work. As far as Koepke and Pearson are concerned, Koepke, I think, has continued to be, a fairly solid contributor. The past game or so that he's played with the Jets, I think he's a fine forechecker. I think he's got enough skill to be a little bit more patient on the puck, and I've seen pretty positive things out of him. I think, as a fourth line guy, he kind of reminds me of that Stenlund sort, where he's defensively responsible. He'll do some good forechecking work. And sometimes there's a risk of people pigeonholing a guy based on kind of the physicality and the forechecking ability. But Koepke actually is somebody who's a little more patient, right? He'll look for good passing seams. He thinks about, how to create good offensive opportunities. He's got some real jump to his game. And it's enough to where, I think that there's some upside with him. I'm not talking about a guy who's going to slide into your top 6, but I think Koepke legitimately brings something that maybe the fourth line could genuinely use. So I think of the free agent signings, he might have the most technical upside in a way. Obviously, Toews is, on paper, the guy with the most upside. But if we're talking about maybe a depth player of Koepke's ilk, I think he's got something, a little extra juice, something kind of fun to watch, maybe in kind of that Parker Ford vein. Pearson, on the other hand, he's having trouble. I was worried that Toews maybe was going to have some issues keeping up, maybe same with the Nyquist. But of the guys who were skating out there, Pearson looks like he's been, uh, the guy to maybe get hit by age the hardest. And it's really a shame because I watched Pearson during his best years with the Kings, and he was a really fun two-way complementary winger with a great shot, smart instincts, a bit of a pesky nature. I wouldn't say that like it was his biggest thing, but he knew where to be and when to be there at the right time that he was needed. So this version of him, I don't quite know how this is going to work. The Jets are trying to use him as a PKer. Would not do that personally. The skating is a big enough issue to where I think he's a little cooked, and I think the defensive work is going to be hard for him, especially if he has to get the puck out of the defensive zone. You could maybe ask somebody else to do it and have Pearson be, a supporting body, but like usually with this stuff, you need guys who can skate pretty quickly. It's maybe why a Tanev or a Connor can maybe work in these sorts of situations. But Pearson on the PK, I probably wouldn't go that route. As far as the fourth line is concerned, the main thing that you have to hope here is that Pearson can kind of feed off of what his line mates do. I think he still has a great NHL release, and that part's not really in question. The rest of his game, that's going to be harder to figure out. So, yeah, going to be interesting to track that one. He was probably one of the signings that I think was most on the cusp of maybe being supplanted by one of the kids. And, given what we've seen in the first game, I don't know if that my assessment has really changed. That said, I think he's going to be one of the starters. We know how the Jets are. Winnipeg likes their waiver eligible guys to be, or waiver exempt guys to be down with the Moose. And so, they'll probably do that so they don't have to worry about, calling him up and stuff. But Pearson, yeah, probably not the player that I was hoping he was going to be. And he could certainly find maybe a fountain of youth at some point this season. Maybe he turns back the clock. For me, it is a shame because I've been a Pearson fan for a long time. So, seeing your favorite players kind of slowly age out is always a hard thing. And it's just father time wins eventually. So as long as Tanner can keep finding ways to get on the score sheet, I think that's probably the main thing that you'd be looking for. I think maybe even on the second power play unit, there could be something there with that in zone setup. So I think he's got a useful shooting tool set. I'm just not sure about the rest of the mobility. That part's kind of, a bigger question mark. And so if he can find a way to work around that, maybe you can make it happen and make it work. But yeah, I think for the first game, not super in love with that combo, right? I think the Jets' fourth line needs to be mobile. I think they need to be quick. And if they can apply offensive pressure, that's great. Pearson can do a little bit of that, more so on the offensive pressure side, less so on the mobile side. And, with Barron and Koepke likely being his teammates for this one, is that going to work? Is that trio going to be effective? I have some doubts and question marks about it, but we'll see. The Jets are probably going to try it anyways. And if it really doesn't work, they've got options. It's not like Pearson was brought in to be, the game-changing presence. He's a good veteran with a lot of experience and can probably offer some mentorship and tips to some of the young kids, because I think at some point we are going to see more of these kids filtering in over the next couple of seasons. And so some guys with genuine cup-winning pedigree educating the kids, teaching them, the good habits of being a pro and how to adapt to this NHL level, I don't think is the worst thing. I do feel like this could be the transition season in a way, even though we might not see many of the rookies, but maybe they're starting to prepare for the next crop of young kids. So we'll see how all of that shapes up. But of course, with this game down, the Jets have lost both of their preseason games. I don't really care, to be honest. I was entertained. I thought, the Jets had some really good shifts against the Oilers. It's unfortunate that they ended up falling a bit short, but I generally liked what I saw from a lot of the youth these first couple of games. Barlow, I think, is one of the most impressive performers, and I want to talk a little bit about what I want to see out of him for Friday's game because he will be playing, and I am pretty excited about his development trajectory. We'll chat about that coming right up. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in these closing thoughts as we're just chatting a little bit about preseason game number 2, the Toews debut, the debut of some of the new veterans, and now we come to game 3 against the Oilers. This is going to be an interesting one for the Jets because the group that they're dressing is, quite frankly, predominantly middle to bottom six and Moose. So this is a very depth-heavy lineup, which we've seen a bit of. But I think in terms of this group, we've got some line combinations that are going to be probably expected. Niederreiter, Nemesnikov, and Iafallo will probably be your third line to start the year. Nemesnikov is definitely expected to be the 3C unless Toews can't go for some reason. I think in an ideal world, you have something like I said earlier, Scheifele, Lowry, Toews, and maybe Nemesnikov as your 4C, or as a winger, Barron with him, on the fourth line could be really elite. So there's that option. But I think, just to start the year, the Jets are going to try and make something happen. N&I is an okay line. I do think it lacks some offensive punch, but I think in terms of defensive work, Nemesnikov and Iafallo will certainly be really no offense shutdown kind of guys. Iafallo, I think, can work when you have like a lot of high-end skill with him. We saw it with the CSI line, but I think if you're asking him to play with Niederreiter and Nemesnikov, this is going to be a really defensively oriented forechecking line meant to make life hell for the opponents. If that's what they can accomplish, I think that's fine, right? You're not asking them to be elite offensive creators, especially not to start the season. You're going to be out without one of your top two-way centers. It's just going to have to do, right? Until the Jets figure out something a little more long-term. The second line that we're seeing in rushes, we've got Koepke, Barron, and Pearson. You've heard my thoughts about this trio. I think Koepke and Barron together, that works. Pearson on the fourth, I feel a little bit less confident in. Would love to see him prove me wrong and have a really solid season, but so far, some of the concerns people had about where his game was when he left Vancouver and Montreal, that does appear to be somewhat legitimate. So keep an eye on that. As far as the other lines are concerned, we've seen Di Giuseppe, Gustafsson, and Fagemo. I think, Gustafsson's going to be the 13th forward for the team this year. I don't know why the Jets don't really seem to be that fond of Gus. He, in my mind, is very clearly one of the better bottom six options you have. And at times I've wondered if he's had another level to his game. He'll always feel a little bit like maybe the one that got away. He had a rough start to his NHL career, but over the past year or so, I really feel that we've seen Gus kind of grow into his own. It'll be interesting to see if Fagemo can maybe get some offense going. He's a guy who could actually be fighting for an NHL spot at some point. I know that there are some folks still holding out hope that, the offense from the AHL translates at some point to the NHL. As far as the fourth line is concerned, we've got Barlow, Lambert, and Zilkin. And Barlow, I've got to say, has been one of the highest risers in the prospect stock for me. I think he has finally started to look like the pro that I hoped he would. I spent some months ago talking about his development track kind of hitting some snags, and there were parts of his game where you really needed to see him be more creative. And I don't just mean like doing, fancy little dangles and dekes and stuff. What I meant was really using more of the ice, showing better vision, being more creative in possession and looking to create space and offense. And I think Barlow has really ticked off a lot of those boxes. This version of him that's come into preseason and camp has been like a generational leap over what we saw before. And I don't mean that in the disparaging way, because what he did before was just score lots of goals. That's awesome. That's exactly what you want to do in the juniors. But when you get to the pros, finding those opportunities to score goals can be harder, right? Space is at a premium. It's tougher to get into those lanes. And I think Barlow has demonstrated a ton of growth. Like this summer, I don't know what he's eaten. Clearly, he and Zilkin have had their Wheaties or something like super powerful, because both really kind of came into camp shot out of a cannon. They looked fantastic. And, if this is what the Moose are getting with both Barlow and Zilkin, I think you have two guys who are finally looking to really reestablish their names in the Jets pool and maybe fighting for roster spots in the very near future. I hope they both have really good years, man. Having Barlow with his release actually find some consistency at the pro level would be a godsend for this pool. We don't have a lot of really good shooters in our prospect system. We've got guys like he and Walton who are definitely really good scorers, but not many players just have a purely dominant release. And it's not like Barlow's shot is going to be line A powerful, but it's really darn good. And so if he can find a way to make more use of that and get into those passing and shooting lanes more frequently, demonstrate more of that two-way acumen, I think you have a really underrated gem in the pool. And it seems like he and Jokin have definitely said that they're coming into camp to make some sort of a statement. They want to, have people remember their names. And I think that they've done a great job of that. Lambert, I don't think he's going to get as much credit as he deserves for what he's done, but I thought he's been really solid. The last game against the Oilers, I saw a lot of good rushes. I thought he was smart with the puck. There were moments where Lambert occasionally, got himself into some trouble, but overall, right, like I think he continues to show that he can do some face-off stuff. He can win some wall battles and be a bit of a pest on the forecheck, and he's got that level of, skating and skill that to me translates to 40 to 50 points in the NHL at some point, maybe more. As a complementary piece alongside really high-end skill, I think Lambert could be a bit of a beast. And I still have a lot of faith in him. I do still think that we'll see him start to really make an NHL impact sometime in the next year or so. I hope it's this year, maybe a call-up of some sort. I think he's got more in the tank than what people imagine him to. But that is a story for another day. We've also got Fleury and Heinola together as a pairing, Stanley and Salamonson, Phillips and Bauer, and Saltner and Barteau. You can kind of tell which of these are going to be more Moose pairings. Fleury-Heinola will be interesting because we had, Heinola and Shen. Fleury-Heinola will skate well. With Fleury, we'll have to see how the decision-making handles. Sometimes, he does skate well with the puck, but he gets himself into trouble, Lucas Sabisa style. If you remember, Sabisa could kind of skate from one moment and get himself under pressure in another and then turn over the puck. Fleury has some of those traits. Not quite as common or frequent, and, he can skate himself out of trouble, but yeah, I think it's just something where, as far as Heinola is concerned, just be, responsible with the puck, make sure that you are always available for an outlet, and kind of clean up if your partner has an issue. And it's not like Heinola is going to win every battle himself either. He'll need Fleury to kind of watch his back and make sure he doesn't get into trouble. Stanley Salamonson, that'll be intriguing, I guess. Stanley hasn't really looked any different than usual. Salomonson's been great. Salo, I think, is closer to the NHL than I thought. So, hey, that's awesome. If he makes the team next year, fantastic. We really could use some quality right-handed support because the support that we have right now is doing a decent enough job, but you can tell age is slowing them down. So lots of stuff kind of coming in the pipelines. Preseason against the Oilers, let's go for round number 2, and let's hope that the Jets can find a way to squeeze out a victory. I've been impressed with some of the kids so far. Now it's time to see if some of the depth guys can step up and maybe win us a game. We'll chat about that game on tomorrow night's episode, and then on Saturday, because we didn't have an episode on Wednesday, we'll have some thoughts on Calgary versus Winnipeg. But for tonight's show, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow night, so have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.